My name is Scott Hildreth, and I'm the director of the Center for Great Commission Studies and assistant professor of missiology at Southeastern, where every classroom is a Great Commission classroom. Here at Southeastern, we take seriously the final words of Jesus, who said, "Go and make disciples of all nations." One way we seek to accomplish this is through higher scholarship. The PhD in Applied Theology and International Missiology is designed for missionaries who are currently serving overseas and want to more effectively proclaim the gospel in their contexts. These students and alumni are providing vital resources to equip the church around the world and mobilize Christians here in America. To that end, it gives me great pleasure to introduce one of my former students, our plenary speaker this afternoon, Dr. Matt Bennett. Matt and his wife Emily, along with their 3 children, served with the International Mission Board in North Africa and the Middle East for 7 years. He completed his PhD in missiology at Southeastern Seminary in 2017 and has focused his research on Christian missiology and the missiological engagement with Islam. Matt currently serves as Assistant Professor of Missions and Theology at Cedarville University in Cedarville, Ohio. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Matt Bennett.
Good afternoon. I am honored and grateful to be here with you for this symposium today. Thank you to Southeastern for hosting it and to Dr. Pratt for the kind invitation. My name is Matt Bennett. I'm a 3-time graduate of Southeastern, and most recently in 2017 graduated with my PhD in Applied Theology and International Missiology. Today what I want to talk about is Islam, revelation, and communication. Why knowing Islamic theology is vital to gospel communication. I should also note that I am currently an assistant professor of missions and theology at Cedarville University, and so much of what I'm working through here is the framework for the way that I approach a study of non-Christian religion in the classroom as well. In one of our first seminars for Southeastern's PhD program, Dr. Heath Thomas, who was then the director of the PhD program, addressed our cohort. While multiple subfields were represented throughout the room, all of us were in the beginning stages of pursuing doctorates in applied theology. In his opening comments, Dr. Thomas described the theological process as a pyramid that progresses from biblical theology to systematic theology to historical theology before eventually emerging in applied theology. He presented this picture of the process to us as a summons to us in our applied theology studies to recognize the diligence and rigor that it would take to build solid applied theology only upon a foundation of biblical, systematic, and historical theology. This concept proved transformative for how I viewed not only my studies, but also my task as a then-current missionary, and now my work as a professor of missions and theology at Cedarville University. I want to lean into Dr. Thomas's particular summons in our time together today to show how vital this theological pyramid process is to the discipline of missiology academically and to the task of missions in practice. In addition to doing the hard work of Christian theology, however, I want to argue that it is essential for a missiologist to consider alternative theologies present in the context prior to offering application. Such attention not only helps us to prevent naive and potentially syncretistic adoption of non-Christian ideas, but it also helps to explain perennial difficulties in gospel communication. For the purposes of this address, I want to show how the Islamic doctrine of God influences the Islamic doctrine of revelation, which then ultimately results in a great deal of apparent common ground that gives way to divergent concepts. To argue this thesis, I'll be building on some of my own recent research as it pertains to a Christian engagement with Islam. This particular address is derived from a chapter in a forthcoming book entitled The Quran and the Christian. However, it is also an expansion upon some themes that are embedded in other books that I've published recently. First, my dissertation entitled Narratives in Conflict, Atonement in Hebrews and the Quran, explores the question, why is it so difficult to discuss atonement in a meaningful way with Muslims? In so doing, it uncovers linguistic, ritual, narrative, and worldview conflicts that emerge when discussing this topic, and provides a suggestion that the book of Hebrews is uniquely suited to explaining this concept biblically to a Muslim. On a slightly more accessible and broad level then, I recently wrote a book called 40 Questions About Islam. And that's part of Kriegel's Academic's popular and very helpful 40 Questions series. The 40 Questions book investigates a number of different aspects of Islam in order to familiarize a Christian with Islamic beliefs, but then also to help investigate where those apparently shared concepts give way to divergent ideas. This paper will consider one such apparent similarity in considering the Islamic doctrine of revelation. In so doing, we'll encounter several points of superficial common ground that are undermined by a more fundamental dissimilarity. Each point of apparent common ground might tempt a missionary to stand upon it in order to build rapport, only to find that they are standing upon communicative quicksand due to a naive understanding of Islamic theology. In fact, though we are concerned with the Islamic doctrine of revelation, we're going to discover differences in the Islamic doctrine of God, anthropology, and soteriology along the way. In light of this, I want to demonstrate how a rigorous theological reflection, both of Christian and non-Christian theology, is not the concern of ivory tower academics alone, but is eminently pressing upon practitioners who long to faithfully minister the gospel in their given contexts. We'll begin with the Islamic doctrine of revelation. In order to demonstrate why familiarity with non-Christian theology is vital to communicating the gospel, this paper will explore the question, what does the Quran reveal? In short, Islam teaches that the Quran reveals God's will and guidance. While initially a Christian might concur that the Bible likewise reveals God's will and guidance, it is necessary to consider the fact that the Quran is satisfied to present God's will without revealing much of God himself. In many streams of Islamic thought and theology, the God of Islam himself remains transcendent and inscrutable. This is based upon the Islamic doctrine of Tawheed, or the absolute oneness of God, which is repeatedly recognized as one of the most central and definitive aspects of Islamic thought. Other streams of Islamic thought contend that one can perhaps speak truly about knowing things about God, provided that any such knowledge of God is restricted to how the Quran has described him. Yet even those Muslims who contend that the Quran reveals something about God that can be known stop short of the intimate, immanent knowledge of God's presence and his role as our Heavenly Father, much less of God as one who would take on flesh and walk among us. Former Muslim Nabil Qureshi highlights this Quranic distinction from biblical revelation clearly as he writes, and I quote, "As a part of our understanding of Tawheed, we need to include a balanced understanding of Allah's self-revelation. Allah intends man to pursue the relationship of a servant to his master, but not the relationship of a child with his father. Nothing in the Quran suggests that Allah desires intimacy with humanity." End quote. It is this doctrine of Tawheed, God's monadic unity and undivided singularity, that prohibits God from engaging humanity relationally because it establishes God himself as one in whom there exists no interpersonal relationship from eternity past. As such, the doctrine of God affects the doctrine of revelation. Though the Quran is full of statements about God, it is not primarily concerned with introducing God himself. Renowned Islamic scholar Fazlur Rahman makes this clear as he writes, quote, "The Quran is no treatise about God and his nature. His existence for the Quran is strictly functional. He is creator and sustainer of the universe and of man, and particularly the giver of guidance for man, and he who judges a man individually and collectively and metes out to him merciful justice." End quote. Some Muslim theologians go so far as to deny that God reveals himself at all, contending that the Quran's descriptions merely refer to God's occasional actions, and that his nature and character remain undisclosed and unknowable. For instance, Ismail al-Faruqi distinguishes Christian conceptions of revelation from Islamic teaching, saying, quote, "God does not reveal himself. He does not reveal himself to anyone in any way. God reveals only his will. God is transcendent, and once you talk about self-revelation, you have hierophancy and immanence, and then the transcendence of God is compromised." End quote. While perhaps an extreme example of Islamic thought, al-Faruqi's conclusion clearly demonstrates the tendency for Muslims to elevate God's total transcendence to the degree that, through the Quran, God primarily reveals his will rather than revealing himself. For a Christian, such an answer should immediately expose a foundational difference between the Islamic and Christian understandings of divine revelation. The Christian concept of God certainly includes a recognition of the partial hiddenness of God due to the impossibility of comprehending his infinite nature. Yet, the Bible teaches that God has made himself known and knowable most centrally in the incarnation of Christ. Thus, the primary content of revelation within Christian theology is God himself. The beauty and perhaps audacity of the biblical invitation to know God emerges from the fact that he has made himself immanent in part, that he might relate personally and even intimately with his creation. Since the object of revelation is of a different nature, discussion about a book of revelation must take into account these differences. A Christian who is either inspecting the Quran or conversing with someone under its influence must understand that what is revealed in the Quran is a will more than it is a person. This fact can often be obscured by what superficially appears to be shared concepts about God, humanity's role as his subjects, and how to please him. Yet upon closer inspection, significant differences emerge, beginning with the very first chapter of the Quran. In this section, we're going to look at Al-Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran, as an overview. If you pick up the Quran and begin reading on the first page, you'll find the short 7-verse surah known as Al-Fatiha. Despite its brevity, Al-Fatiha provides a summary of much of the rest of the Quran's teaching, and as such, it is sometimes referred to as the Quran's table of contents. For our purposes, investigation of the contents of Al-Fatiha provides us both insight into what the Quran purports to reveal and several apparent similarities with biblical teaching that require further investigation. Before proceeding, we might pause to read Al-Fatiha prior to unpacking it. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Praise be to God, Lord of the worlds, the merciful, the compassionate, Master of the day of judgment. You we serve, and you we seek for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those whom you have blessed, not the path of those on whom your anger falls, nor of those who go astray. Now, without first considering the effect of the Islamic doctrines of God and revelation, a Christian might be tempted to view much of this introduction as being compatible with Christian theology and biblical teaching. Yet again, we must look carefully before affirming shared belief. Beginning with the Bismillah, the first phrase, in the name of God. The first verse of this chapter is so commonly used within Islamic practice that it has its own shorthand reference, the Bismillah. The invocation of God's name appears at the beginning of each of the Quran's 114 chapters, with the sole exception being chapter 9, which some scholars believe to have originally been connected to chapter 8. It is common practice among Muslims to recite the Bismillah at the beginning of any undertaking as a plea for God's help. Even seemingly mundane tasks such as turning on the ignition of one's car are often accompanied by this appeal to the name of God. Yet it is interesting to consider the fact that despite the regularity of invoking the name of God, Bismillah, the Quran nowhere provides the reader with a personal name by which God might be known. To those unfamiliar with the Arabic language, it's common to mistake the word Allah as the personal name of the Islamic deity. Yet, formally, Allah is merely a word formed by attaching the definite article, al, to the generic word in Arabic for God, ilaha, making Allah. Thus, Allah is not a personal name like Yahweh is. It's simply a way of referring to the single member of the category God. Furthermore, the idea of God's names has at times been a contentious issue within Islamic theology. For instance, in Quran 17:110, one finds instructions to the reader to call on God or to the merciful, whichever you call on, to him belong the best names. Now, prompted by this verse, many early Muslims began to collect and compile all of the Quranic and traditional names that could be attributed to God. And the list that resulted, there are actually several lists of 99 names with various entries included in some and excluded from others. But the result was a list of 99 names used in reference or description about God. Such a collection, however, caused early Islamic scholars to fear that they were introducing divisions and distinctions into the concept of God, and thus compromising that essential idea of Tawheed, or the unity of God's essence. Though it is common today to see Muslims thumbing through a chain of prayer beads which bear the 99 names, they are more commonly understood not such as names as much as characteristics or attributes of God. Through the repetition of Al-Fatiha, Muslims begin their prayers each day, 5 times a day, in the act of reading the Quran and engaging in daily tasks with an appeal to the name of God for help through this phrase, Bismillah, and yet at the same time, the very recognition that God's personal name is unknown reinforces God's total transcendence and maintains the separation between God and humanity. The second thing we need to take into account is the twice repeated phrase, the compassionate and the merciful. Moving on to the second phrase of Al-Fatiha, the reader encounters 2 references to God repeatedly used throughout the Quran, the compassionate, Ar-Rahman, and merciful, Ar-Rahim. This phrase appears twice in Al-Fatiha, foreshadowing its centrality as a reference to God throughout the rest of the Quran. And in fact, the Quran applies the first of these 2 references, Ar-Rahman, only to God throughout its pages, which leads Islamic scholar David Burrell to note that most Muslims take the compassionate or the merciful to be the most expressive names of Allah. Throughout its pages, the Quran connects God's compassion specifically to his provision of instructions on how to obey his will. For example, after Satan, Shaitan, causes Adam and his wife to slip from paradise, the Quran describes God's communication of instructions to Adam as evidence of his compassion, as we see in Quran 2:37. As it says, "Then Adam received certain words from his Lord, and he turned to him in forgiveness. Surely he is the one who turns in forgiveness, the compassionate." The reference there is Ar-Rahim. In other words, God provides words of guidance as evidence of his compassion in response to human need for guidance and direction. Therefore, as these characteristics of God, Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, are given to the reader to understand that God is one who exhibits compassion, they also actually reinforce the Quran's concern to reveal the will of God and the instructions that he provides as evidence of his compassion. The next phrase we need to look at, "Praise be to the Lord, creator of the worlds." As noted by Fazlur Rahman's comments at the introduction to this paper, the Quran is satisfied to introduce Allah simply as the master and creator who sovereignly stands behind and above all things in creation. He is worthy of the worship and submission of his creatures by virtue of this position as creator. The Quran views humanity as being obligated to submit to God and to render unto him praise and worship in light of his creative power and work. Reinforcing and reminding the reader that God is the creator, the Quran includes several accounts of God's acts of creation throughout its pages. As is characteristic of all the narrative sections, or most of the narrative sections of the Quran, however, details of the creation account are sparse. And this paucity of detail emphasizes the fact that, for the Quran, God's power exhibited in creating is the foundation for his exercise of supreme authority over the universe. For instance, we read in Quran 7:54, Surely your Lord is God, who created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. Then he mounted the throne. The night covers the day, which it pursues urgently, and the sun and the moon and the stars are subjected all by his command. Is it not a fact that to him belong the creation and the command? Blessed be God, Lord of the worlds. This particular creation account not only reinforces God's total authority over his creation, but it refers to God as the Lord of the worlds, thus repeating the phrase we just see here in Al-Fatiha. The most important aspect, then, of each one of the Quran's creation accounts is that they reinforce God's sovereign dominion over all created things. Moving on, master of the day of judgment. A fourth aspect of the Quranic content of Revelation is the reality of impending eschatological judgment. Again, the first verses of Al-Fatiha introduce the idea through the coming day of that though the coming day of a judgment will prove to be a recurring theme throughout the rest of the Quran. Connected to the Quran's conception of God, this phrase here in Al-Fatiha establishes God himself as the one who will mete out judgment on that last day. Indeed, God in the Quran is the master over the eschatological fate of all who will pass under his judgment. Though the Quran consistently references God's role as the final arbiter of judgment, the event of judgment itself is a central aspect of what the Quran reveals. Throughout the Quran, readers are warned to consider their lives in light of the coming day of judgment. In the words of Daniel Madigan, the Quran is replete with cataclysmic details of the end of the world. Madigan continues, "No one, we are assured repeatedly, will escape death. And so it is understood that at a certain point everything will perish, then all will be brought to life once more and gathered for judgment before the throne of God." Moreover, as the Quran warns of the coming day of judgment, it does so in terms that are both future-looking and unpredictably imminent. Mark Anderson lists Quran 74, 82, 96, 102, and 111 as being particularly acute examples of the Quranic warning that, and I quote, "the eschaton may at any point break through into the here and now to obliterate the heedless," end quote. Thus, in Al-Fatiha and onward, the Quran reveals impending eschatological judgment as a summons to humanity to consider their lives in light of their obligation to submit their wills to the revealed will of God. You we serve, and you we seek for help. A fifth aspect of the Quran's revelation that emerges within Al-Fatiha is the responsibility of human beings to serve and worship Allah and to depend upon His help. Since Al-Fatiha has first recognized God as the creator of the worlds, it naturally progresses to hold human beings accountable for taking an appropriate posture of worship, service, and submission to this God. One noteworthy aspect of this particular section of Al-Fatiha is the Arabic word that is translated serve above. The root word of this word occurs some 275 times throughout the Quran. Depending upon the context, this word group can either refer to worship or service or slavery. As it occurs here in Al-Fatiha, translators are justified in rendering in English this verb either as we serve or we worship. Such linguistic flexibility reinforces the conceptual proximity of the Quran's teaching on servitude to its teaching on worship. In other words, a servant of Allah is at one and the same time a worshiper of Allah. Now, the concept of submission is intimately ingrained within Islam to the extent that it provides the etymological root from which one forms the related Arabic words Islam and Muslim. Therefore, one of the central aspects of the Islamic doctrine of revelation is the recognition that humans are servants of God who are to worship Him by submitting to His will. The content of His will is disclosed to the reader as the Quran's divine guidance, which evidences the giver of the Quran as one who's compassionate to give that guidance. Now, this leads us to Al-Fatiha's sixth contribution to the doctrine of revelation, guidance to the straight path. The Quran regularly refers to itself as guidance from God. One clear example of this can be seen in Quran 1689, which states, "We have sent down to you the book as an explanation for everything, and as a guidance and mercy, as good news for those who submit." Now, this guidance is understood as the disclosure of God's will, a register of ethical expectations for those who seeking to live according to God's will, and as a reminder of all of the things that humans are quick to forget. For the current purposes of exploring a general doctrine of revelation, it suffices to note that the Quran intends to be received as the means by which God guides believers to the straight path of obedience and submission. In his commentary on this verse, A.J. Droge describes the straight path as, quote, "the revealed path of religious truth and right conduct," end quote. In other words, this path is the ethical and spiritual guidance and instruction for how to live according to God's revealed will. Finally, Al-Fatiha describes the straight path as the path that God has blessed. Similar promises of blessing for the devout Muslim are pervasive throughout the Quran, connecting ethical living to divine favor. While the Quran beckons Muslims to dutifully live out their roles as servants of God, it also holds out promise of reward and blessing for the faithful. Furthermore, this straight path stands in contrast to the paths which lead people astray and paths upon which God pours out His anger. In this way, Al-Fatiha concludes by petitioning God to guide those who are submitted to His will and to pour out blessings upon those who follow the straight path. So, in summary of the Quranic doctrine of revelation as found here in Al-Fatiha. The first chapter of the Quran, Al-Fatiha, not only opens the Quran, but it establishes the Quran as the mechanism by which God's will is revealed. When a person receives such revelation from God, submission is the expected response and posture. And the proper result of such submission is attentive living according to the Quran's teaching, following it as a guide down the straight path. The essence of the Islamic doctrine of revelation, then, is that the Quran reveals the will of God to God's creatures who are obligated to follow it. In so doing, the Quran refers to itself as serving two primary roles, offering guidance and providing reminders. As seen above, guidance is requested from God in Al-Fatiha, and the Quran presents itself as God's merciful answer to this request. Additionally, it is important to note that elsewhere in the Quran, it identifies itself as a book of reminder. In his commentary on one such instance, Quran scholar A.J. Droge notes that the word reminder, as it appears in the Quran, refers specifically to the Quran as God's mechanism for helping humans to, quote, keep something before the mind by repeatedly calling it to attention, with the sense of admonition, exhortation, and even warning, end quote. In other words, the Quran records the reminders of God's commands that humans are wont to forget. Furthermore, the presentation of the Quran as a reminder of God's ways reinforces the basic Islamic conception of humanity as being inherently forgetful and negligent of the ways of God. As Islamic scholar Sayyid Hussein Nasr says, quote, without the aid of God, man cannot discover by himself the way of salvation, that is, the straight path. Man needs revelation because he is by nature negligent and forgetful. He is by nature imperfect. Therefore, he needs to be reminded, end quote. As a result of this Islamic understanding of human weakness, the Quran presents itself as the answer by providing divine guidance toward the straight path and also prompting remembrance of teachings that humans tend to forget or set aside. Now, while the Bible certainly makes similar claims and provides guidance and insight into God's will, neither the Bible nor the Christian doctrine of revelation are exhausted by merely presenting the will of God. Instead, a Christian understanding of revelation contends that what is revealed through the prophets, the canon of Scripture, and ultimately through the incarnation is God himself. In order to apply this to a Christian missiological engagement with Muslims, then, we must consider some of the ramifications of this essential distinction. We see that in biblical revelation, our understanding of what is revealed is more than merely God's will. Though the Christian reader may have read the previous section sympathetically, seeing parallels between the teaching of Al-Fatiha and the Bible, it's helpful to highlight some of the conceptual divergence between the Quran and the Bible at this essential juncture of understanding the content of revelation. What one believes revelation to reveal will ultimately shape and direct one's response to that revelation. Now, each of the following aspects of Christian theology is in need of additional nuance and could certainly be expanded upon to a much greater degree. However, due to the constraints of time and the likelihood that this audience is already sufficiently familiar with the distinctives that I'm going to list below, a brief summary will suffice to highlight the divergence from Islamic teaching. As noted above, the Christian doctrine of revelation does not merely consider that God reveals his will, but more fundamentally teaches that God reveals himself, and does so as he draws near to dwell among his people. As one theologian, Michael Bird, states, quote, the gospel is a theocentric revelation. It is a pronouncement, a proclamation, a publication of good tidings about God, end quote. Furthermore, Bird argues that the idea of God's self-revelation is centrally and inextricably tied to the gospel of Jesus. One might consider Hebrews 1, Colossians 1, and the prologue to John's gospel, in which God reveals himself and draws near to his creatures in person, in the person and work of Jesus. Another noted theologian, Fred Sanders, contends that God is most fully revealed as Trinity in the incarnation of the Son and in the sending of the Spirit. So, not only does the gospel begin to most clearly reveal God as triune, but it stands at the center of the Christian hope that the God who declared his intention to be with us might in fact be God with us. Thus, for us to distinguish the biblical teaching of revelation from the Quranic concept is not merely splitting hairs. Rather, it strikes at an essential difference between Islam and Christianity. The following section will briefly consider some of the ways that the biblical concept of revelation diverges from what the Quran claims to reveal. First of all, the name of God in the Bible. Like Muslims, Christians and Jews are cognizant of the importance of God's name. Within the biblical story, however, God's name is revealed in the context of his personal interactions with Moses and as a precursor to God uniting himself with all of Israel in covenant. The personal name of God, Yahweh, is intimately connected to the account of the Exodus. This name not only signifies his person and character, but it also instantiates a unique relationship between the Israelites as his covenant people and the God of the universe. The importance of the divine name and nearness is made even more personal in the New Testament as God's people are instructed to address him as Father. The fact that Jesus encourages his followers to address God as Father is scandalously inappropriate to a Muslim audience. Even for Muslims who would contend that God can be known in part through his revelations in the Quran, the idea that he might intimately be known in filial terms is far removed from the Islamic understanding of humans as they relate to God, as servants should relate to masters. In fact, though some authors have compared Al-Fatiha to the Lord's Prayer, Islamic teaching departs from the material in the Lord's Prayer at the point of the very initial address, Our Father. For example, Muhammad Abdul Halim writes, "A Muslim would view the content of the Fatiha as being acceptable to Christians. There are, however, elements in the Lord's Prayer that pose difficulties for a Muslim nurtured on the Fatiha, which is universal. Our limits God to a particular community and to a particular relationship of fatherhood, compared to the sustaining Lord of all the worlds, not the Lord of the Muslims or the Arabs. And although father is a very intimate term to Christians, Muslims would not speak of God as father or as a son." End quote. Thus, even with the extensive list of attributes that one might collect throughout the Quran, God is not conceived of as a being who is to be known intimately. Rather, he is a God to be obeyed, served, and praised by virtue of his sovereign power as creator and the eternal worth that comes from that. Not only is the God of the Quran not known by the title Father, but the fact that he never divulges his personal name reinforces his absolute and eternal transcendence from his servants. Likewise, turning to the idea of compassion and mercy as it's found in the Bible. The immediacy of God's presence among his people also affects how the Bible presents God's mercy and compassion. In contrast to the Quran's view of God's compassion and mercy, the Bible contends God's compassionate love for his creation, and it's connected with his willingness to condescend and reveal himself. The Quran's message appears similar at first glance because it involves God's compassionate revelation of his will and merciful provision of guidance to the otherwise wandering human race. However, since God sends down this revelation of his will as mercy, rather than coming down himself, the conceptual distance is far greater than what it originally appears. The Old Testament explicitly and repeatedly states that it is God's purpose to dwell among his people. However, the proximity of God's presence, specifically his righteousness and his holiness, to a stiff-necked and sin-stained people necessitates the meticulous process of substitutionary, blood-wrought atonement that's described in the Pentateuch as the means of providing God's mercy, while also recognizing his just wrath against sin. The book of Leviticus, and later the author of Hebrews, presents an intricate system of atonement that upholds God's ability to exhibit wrath towards sin, while also providing a means of atonement, forgiveness, and reconciliation, which allow for his holiness again to dwell in the midst of his people without destroying them. For more development on this idea and its relationship to the Quran, as a shameless plea for someone to read my work in my dissertation, see my book, Narratives in Conflict, which was concerned with this particular investigation. That God's compassion would result in his presence among his people is demonstrated centrally in the New Testament through the incarnation and the sending of the Holy Spirit. And the intimate biblical vision of God dwelling amidst his people comes into its full expression in the final vision of biblical hope. In John's eschatological vision recorded in Revelation 21, 3-4, the Christian knowledge of God is most clearly seen as immediate, personal, and intimate as one reads the beautiful phrase, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away." Such a vision and expectation of God's immediate presence dwelling amidst his creation is absent from the Quran's depiction of paradise and from its understanding of God's purposes in creation at all. That God's presence is not imminent or immediate in the Quran, however, allows for a different conception of guidance and ethical living. If God's presence is not promised, then human imperfection is not the problem in the Quran that it is in the Bible, which leads us to the concept of biblical judgment, praise, and guidance. As discussed above, Al-Fatiha reveals God's will in connection with the promises of blessings and the warnings of judgment that pervade the Quran. Additionally, the Quran establishes that it is God's will that humanity should praise and worship God as He alone is the creator of the worlds. In order to do so, the Quran provides guidance and reminder of how to walk the straight path of adherence to God's will. In these three ways, then, a Christian might notice that the Bible appears to exhibit significant overlap with the Quran. The Bible establishes God as the creator who is worthy of human praise and worship in places such as Psalm 33, which calls for praise to be offered to God who has made everything by the power of His word. Likewise, one reads reminders to recall the commands of God, such as Deuteronomy 4:9, which states, "Only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children." And all throughout Scripture, God is guiding His people as to how they are to walk before Him. However, as noted throughout this paper, the Quran reveals instructions on how to find and walk the straight path. In so doing, it assumes human ability to follow the instructions sufficiently enough to follow their way. The Bible, in contrast, reveals the law as the straight path in order to demonstrate human inability to guide themselves. For instance, as Paul reflects on the role of the law in its biblical context, he's convinced that the instructions given in the law prove only to expose human sin and depravity. For example, he writes in Romans 7:10 through 11, "The very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. For sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me and through it killed me." Thus, the law simply lures human sinfulness and imperfection into view in order to expose our inability to live according to God's ways on our own. The difference then between the Quran as an ethical guide and the Bible's ethical guidance is that the Quran is optimistic about the human ability to follow its guidance, to offer pleasing worship, and to avoid divine judgment. The Bible, on the other hand, presents a catalog of ways that humanity has fallen short, and always will fall short, of perfect obedience and pleasing worship. Created for the presence of God, humanity in the Bible is revealed to be sin-stained and incapable of bearing God's presence. The Bible provides its ethical teaching in order to confront humans with their failings and to cause them to cry out for God's mercy and grace in the gospel, to do that which fallen humans are incapable of accomplishing for themselves. In conclusion, then, different expectations of revelation lead to different understandings of God, of sin, of salvation, and of humanity. This paper has explored the concept of revelation provided by the Quran. Primarily, it has concluded that the Quran reveals God's will and a variety of attributes that are understood to more or less describe God. Though there is certainly conceptual overlap in what is revealed in the Bible and the Quran, the Bible is keen to reveal God Himself in a way that the Quran is not. The Quran's reticence to introduce God intimately and interpersonally is connected to the Quranic doctrine of Tawheed, which sets God apart from humanity in a more absolute sense than does the Bible. And furthermore, the revelation of God's will as a sufficient dispensation of compassion and mercy from God reveals the Quran's divergent doctrine of humanity. This distinction is most pronounced in the fact that the Bible reveals Himself through His intention to be God with us. Throughout this brief paper, we've encountered themes that appear to be congruent with biblical teaching, and yet, having established a prior understanding of how Islamic theology approaches the Quran as a book of revelation, and how it conceives of God as the transcendent creator, we have ultimately discovered significant divergence underlying the features that initially presented themselves as common ground. My intention in working through this has been to argue that this essential difference in the doctrines of revelation and God cause apparent common ground to give way to divergent teachings. Thus, for the academic investigation of Islam from a Christian vantage point, and for the Christian missionary longing to communicate the biblical gospel to a Muslim friend, knowledge of Islamic theology must precede and pervade the applied theology process. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to our question and answer time.